Hi, it's Mike Thornton here, and we're down at Jigsaw's new headquarters in Golden Square in London. And we've just been listening and watching some presentations from a number of people, including Andy Bradfield here. And you were teamed up with Walter, composer, and you were showing us how you compose and mix the music for some films. So tell us a bit about the workflow that you use.
That's right. Well, Walter's the composer and I'm the mixer, and he basically has been giving me the backing tracks plus the orchestra to mix at my studio. So obviously everything's come out of Logic initially, which has been laid up in a Pro Tools session for me to mix. And then in the case of the Ronaldo stuff that we just finished, that also had strings and piano recorded at Abbey Road Studio 2. So they were loaded up into a session in Pro Tools. I then color-coded them, laid them out, bussed them as I would do normally, and then set about mixing them. And of course, in this, as I explained when I did the presentation just now, you're always kind of slightly against the clock because music tends to be done kind of last minute. And so you always end up in this slightly compressed time frame where, you know, the last minute changes are done by Walter. He has to print all the parts for me to mix and for them to record to, and then you're straight into mixing and sign off, and then it's off to the dubbing stage. So to be honest, Pro Tools is a godsend for me in that respect because not only does it sound great, it's very flexible, but the recall is totally invaluable because it means that on these big sessions, I can kind of go through usually most of the entire film or TV series, and then I usually loop back and go back over it again and then get into a bit more detailed work before we start getting into kind of mixed reviewing and stuff with the clients, and obviously with Walter and the director or whoever comes to review the mixes. So presumably you get a guide dialogue track so that you can get a sense of what the dialogue's doing, so that you, as you said, you can keep out the way of the dialogue. Yes, I mean, I guess that's always kind of the golden rule really, is that anything that's done to picture where there's dialogue, you try and sort of stay out of the way. Now, I mean, to be fair, that's something that Walter would do in terms of his composition and how he's written the piece anyway. But at the same time, I always try and keep an ear on that when I'm working, certainly when I'm doing initial balance, because, and in fact, I find I've got an icon, the previous DigiDesign desk in my studio, and I find it really useful to put that on a custom fader, which I have in all the sessions, and it means I can jump to that really quickly and turn it on or off, because often when you're then going through and reviewing the stuff later with the director, they often want to see a part with the dialogue to make sure everything's as it should be. Yeah, and so coming back to the way you work with Walter, he works in Logic Pro, so does he effectively bounce out audio, WAV stems of all his keyboards and instruments, and so he hands you a wad of WAVs? Basically, yes. He hands us a folder full of WAVs for each cue, and then usually also a click track as well. And then quite often, if there's tempo stuff as well, he'll often give us a tempo map as well and a start point. And something he did actually, which was incredibly useful as a kind of cross-check, was he actually put the time code number in the name of each part. So the file name. So the file name said, you know, 1 kick drum, and it says TC, and then and although that might sound a little bit over the top, it's actually very useful later on if anything is amiss, because that's the one time when, you know, the wheels can really well and truly come off, is that when you're laying up sessions, especially when they come to me and perhaps I'm not always as au fait with the pieces. Obviously become, you know, very au fait with them during the course of mixing, because you listen to them non-stop for 2 weeks. But actually at that initial setup point, it stops a lot of problem occurring. And then the other thing that I always get them to do, or Walter always does for me, is actually gives me a rough mix of where he had it in Logic. So that's something I route out of a separate output, and I have that on a separate external source, so I can flick to that at any point just to check that it's not going away from where it should do. Because one of the things that does happen is that when you add orchestra, that's often replacing samples, and sometimes it takes a leap and it's a good thing, but sometimes it can end up going somewhere else, and that's something I always have to try and be aware of. Now, you were also talking about colour coding. Just give us because we've been discussing on Pro Tools Expert about different colour coding
technique. So what's your color coding philosophy?
It's funny, I sort of have certain things that I'm quite fastidious about color coding. Drums, for some reason in my world, they're always blue, like a quite vivid blue. And lead vocals are always red, bass is always brown, just because it sounds kind of brown. But honestly, the other stuff I'm not so worried about. What I tend to do is I tend to do it in blocks of color, because it makes an enormous session much easier to digest. And I think sometimes when you leave it on its default behavior, and especially when you load up, maybe, I mean, some cases there's like 120 tracks of audio. That's not necessarily 120 parts, because some of this stuff is obviously multi-layered. Yeah. And what tends to happen sometimes is that, they'll print the kick, the snare, the hi-hat of one instrument, but there'll be multiple parts. So the track count will quickly go up. So I tend to just do it in blocks of colour, because it just makes it much easier when you look at it. It doesn't look overwhelming. And that might sound like a strange thing when you're dealing with audio, but I think the way that your eyes interact with it is actually very important. It's very important to understand that it actually helps you to navigate the session. And then when someone says, do you think the bass could be a bit louder? You can just literally go straight to it. You can
it's that brown one.
Yeah, it's that brown one. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And it sounds very simplistic, but it's actually very useful.
And you were alluding to the fact that since you went to HDX, your preferred audio metering software has disappeared. Pray tell me, what was it?
It was the what was it called? It was the DigiDesign one.
Oh, I
can't remember what it's called.
Phase scope.
Phase scope.
Yeah.
Surround scope and phase scope. But particularly, it was useful because it was previously in Pro Tools 10. Surround scope was just always there, and it was also, more importantly, it was, when I had a TDM system, it was available as a TDM plugin. Now that is particularly useful because it's not adding any significant amount of latency to your output, which is of course precisely where you're going to put it. And one of the problems I've had in looking for a suitable replacement is I preferably want something that's a DSP plugin, and there seems to be very few of those around at the moment.
There are very few DSP plugins,
period.
Because although comparatively you come to the HDX table a little late, I've probably got serial number 001.
Okay, I have got a good excuse though, Mike. Honestly, I do have a good excuse. The reason I left it so long was primarily because I actually had a very big HD system. I actually had an expanded system, like a HD6 with 6 cards, which was incredibly powerful. Now, the thing that I was running up against continuously was partly track count, because in Pro Tools 10, the plugins, the native plugins, when used on auxiliary channels, would steal voices. That was one pain point. The other thing was a little bit with the delay compensation, because you've only got 4,000 samples, and it's something that you have to be very careful not to exceed, because it all goes horribly wrong. And so when HDX came out, it looked amazing, but one of the things was, I thought, realistically, I'm going to have to go, if I go early, and go to Pro Tools 10. Now, the problem with that for me was running big sessions. I was going to run into RAM problems, which I was already doing in 10 anyway. So I basically hung on until 11 had settled. And some of the things that I use, things like UAD, which I'm a huge fan of, and some of the other stuff, hadn't actually settled as 64-bit AAXs. So I was kind of going to solve one problem, but actually create another. And to be honest, it was working. And much as I wanted to do it, I just thought, you know what? There's a right time to do it. And actually, I waited until the beginning of this year, and it had settled suitably, did a complete new install. And actually, I have to say, it's been fantastic.
How have you found the video in 11? Because some people I've been talking to are still working in 10 because of video issues.
Yes, I know there's been a lot of issues. I have to be honest, we had a couple of issues early on, and I think, I can't remember which version of 11 we're on at the moment, but it seems to have kind of ironed itself out for the time being. One of the biggest problems I found with video is the dirty word of codecs. And unfortunately, being an engineer is always a tricky business, because, or especially a mixing engineer, because I'm always torn between creative brain and functional make it work brain. And unfortunately, that's another reason that templates and these other things are good, because you get that donkey work out of the way first of all. And funnily enough, we discovered, even in 10, that H264 codec doesn't seem to be a very good bedfellow in Pro Tools.
No.
No,
It's it's do it when I feel like it.
Yeah, funny enough that on the Ronaldo movie, they sent us the movie in H.264, and every time we hit play, it was just pausing for approximately 2 seconds, and we were going crazy. So in the end, because of lack of time, I mean, if there'd have been more time, I'd have gone back to the picture department and said, please, can we have this in something else? But we were already on the production, and it was causing us problems. So we actually just bit the bullet and converted them ourselves, and we ended up converting them to DNX HD, which gives you a much bigger file size,
but actually
pretty seamless.
Much less load on the system.
Yeah, and I have to say the computer was it was almost like there was no video there.
Yeah,
and to be honest, that's really what you want to get. And it's funny because some of this sort of minutiae you don't discover until you do it the hard way, you know. And it's like, oh yeah, the video, it just works. And another example of that was a few years ago, after a computer change, I was working on The Great Gatsby. And they sent us all the video over in DNX HD, and it wouldn't play. And I'm sitting here scratching my head going, I've got a black screen and audio, and I'm Googling, I'm not finding anything. And then I phoned the guys at Air, and I said, how are you getting this to work? And they went, oh, it just works. And I'm going, no. And eventually, obviously, discovered the magical driver that you need, which then adds that functionality to QuickTime. And of course, I then realised that the guys at Air had obviously done this at some point in the dim and distant past and had forgotten all about it.
Yeah. And I mean, when you were talking about it, I'd forgotten. Of course, yes, you have to download the Avid codecs for the DNX HD, and then it all works fine.
And to be honest, that's another reason, talking about being late to the HX part, another reason that I wanted to do it was do it so that we could go straight to 11, but also so that we had some time to troubleshoot it. And of course, every time I thought about doing it last year, we were in the middle of projects and we were finishing projects, going straight into other projects. And I thought, do you know what? This is just going to be really painful. And I thought, do you know what? I can't do that. I just can't. So I waited until the beginning of the year, and we found a suitable window and thought, right, let's go for it. And actually what was great was we had some projects coming up. We had like a week to kind of properly put it in, test it, because we also shuffled some, because we've got a lot of I/O on the system. Shuffle some interfaces around and move some things around, test the sync, make sure it all works, and actually get that all out of the way before there was actually like proper work coming in, which, as you know, is pretty scary.
Yeah, I remember I had a client-attended session, and I hadn't. They'd sent the video. I thought, oh yeah, that's fine. Dropped it in the session. Client is there. They're wanting to watch the pictures because they hadn't seen these pictures before, and it was not working very well. And I suddenly thought, I need this in DNX. So I sort of was talking about the ethos of the project and what the ideas were all about. Whilst I'm busily opening MPEG stream clip and exporting it as DNX and bring it back into the session in the hope that nobody noticed what I'd done, and then it all worked fine.
But yeah, I think when people talk about video in Pro Tools, you can easily miss that altogether. You know, and it really can be a big pain point. And thankfully for us in 11, it hasn't been too bad. And we have a second system where we play out of a Blackmagic card, which we satellite, so we can show it on a big monitor. And that actually works pretty well. And having said that, I'm not in the position of working my way through an entire movie in one go. So I'm tending to work on individualized cues, you know, because they tend to be, a mix session for me would be one cue, which could be a minute, it could be 30 seconds, it could be 7 minutes. You know, I'm not like, whereas the post-production guys, they tend to work on it in much, much larger chunks.
A reel of time at least.
Which is probably 15, 16 minutes worth. And so if you're gonna start to get problems, that's really, if anything's drifting. I don't think we've checked it through with about a 6-minute clip, and it seemed to be absolutely tight with sync pipped and everything. So I'm reasonably happy that it's working well. But I think because I came late, there'd been a bunch of revisions before, so I probably got the benefit of that as well. Did. So that was an added benefit, really.
Yes, you did. Now, how do you handle picture changes? So you know, Walter's composed brilliant score. You've mixed it. Oh, by the way, we've taken one second, 2 frames out of this, which isn't exactly 2 bars, or you know.
In all honesty, it depends on the project, and it depends on how much time you have on your hands. Because in all honesty, that is, not exactly the most enjoyable process known to man. And it can have a lot of knock-on effects, as you know, not least of which be things like automation and various other things. So generally speaking, I think it's become accepted on certainly most of the projects I've worked on, whether it's film, TV or whatever, that at the point you enter scoring, you've got what you've got, and anything that happens after that tends to happen what I would call in post-production. So it generally would fall on the music editor's desk rather than the mixing engineer.
Sure.
And as I quite rightly point out, I say, you're paying me to mix your tracks, not edit them. And although obviously editing is part of what we do, I do understand that. But obviously there's always exceptions to the rule, and I have had situations like the eponymous Moulin Rouge that I was involved in many years ago, where we did have to do a lot of reconforming, but it was just an ongoing process because it was in a constant state of flux, and because of the way that project was structured, it had to be that way. But I think quite often these days, when the project gets to the point of scoring and then obviously mixing is usually straight afterwards, I think you have to sort of draw a line, and I think it's generally accepted that would happen probably in 5.1 stems, because we would obviously run off a 5.1 mix as a reference, but then we break it out into stems to go to the dubbing engineer or the music editor.
5.1, you were talking about the project that you were playing was originally done in surround. What's your sort of philosophy for surround and music? Because obviously normally we're not, being totally naturalistic about it. One isn't in the middle of the orchestra or the band.
No, you're quite right.
So how does, from your perspective, how does surround and music come together?
I think a couple of things for me. I think, surround is primarily about making a more immersive experience, and obviously having more speakers does that. I mean, at the moment, at this point in time, when I'm mixing surround, I'm mixing 5.1, and there hasn't really been yet a move to mix in any more channels than that, although I wonder if that may happen. I keep asking the question about Dolby Atmos, and I think from what I can glean, it's really something that, at this point in time anyway, seems to be more suited to dubbing than it does to music, certainly in terms of moving things about, because obviously you need to do that in relation to other things that may be going on. And obviously we're often working with scratch dialogue, scratch effects tracks, which may not be a final anyway, but they just give you an idea. And realistically, one of the things that I'm always striving to avoid is too much things actually moving around the stereo. So you tend to go for, certainly on something like an orchestral pieces, you tend to go for sort of static panning, because things moving around tend to be distracting. In the same way, sometimes having too much information, and especially sometimes too much top end information at the back, again tends to be a little bit distracting, because you're kind of going, what's that, and you go, oh, it's a hi-hat, what's it doing over there, and it's taking you away. So again, it goes back to what I said about staying out of the way. So it's interesting, because someone asked me just now after I came off the presentation, they were saying about, what do you do about, upmix and things like that? And I said, well, it has become part of what has to be done these days, because a lot of, pre-recorded material like synths and soft synths is all in stereo.
So do you use upmix plugins?
Yes, I've in the past I've used things like Waves, but just recently I've been using Pentio 7, which actually seems to work very well.
We like Pentio 7.
And most importantly, it seems to fold down quite well.
It does indeed.
Without kind of tripping over its own shoelaces.
I mean, when I've done because I've given both Pentio 4 its predecessor and Pentio 7 editor's choice on Produce Expert. Yeah. And one of the reasons I do that is because the fold down, because what I do is, because obviously on YouTube we can't play this around.
Of course.
So I say, here's the stereo original, and here's the down mix of the up mix. Can you tell the difference? No. Okay, result. You'll have to take my word for it that the surround sounds brilliant.
Yeah, and I have to say, I used it a bit on the Ronaldo movie, and it worked really, really well. And to be honest, it's a bit of a vexing problem, because the other way of doing it is you either just pan that stuff left and right, in which case if you've got orchestrals around you and the other stuff is just at the front, it can kind of feel a little bit unbalanced, because primarily my job is to try and sort of mould those two worlds together, and actually make those two things work together and against the picture. while staying out of the way. So I think something like Pentio is an invaluable thing. And I think also it's got around that thing that I said earlier, which is that I think upmixing used to be considered to be a little bit of a dirty word. Because I think in the early days of plugins and processing, I don't think it was done all that well.
No, you could hear it.
And you could hear it, and I think there was phasing issues, and,
yeah.
and I think those things really started to bite you when you started to fold things down. And of course, inevitably, like you said, with YouTube and TV and other things,
yeah.
and even film, there will come a point where it gets folded down.
Yeah.
So you've got to be aware of that. But I think the Pentio thing was great. I mean, in the past, I used the Wave one a bit, but I sometimes found that on certain material, especially stuff with a lot of bottom end, it was more difficult to get what I wanted. Although on some stuff it worked well, but the Pentio, I've got to say, is phenomenal.
Interesting. So last question I just wanted to pick up on. So you've done your project. You're obviously then presumably handing it back to the mixing supervisor.
Yes, that's right.
What do you output? Presumably, is it 5/1 stems, and how far down, if you like, do the stems go?
I would say on something like that opening sequence that we played earlier, I'll probably 10 or 12 passes plus a reference mix. So normally at the top of the stem session, we put the 5.1 mix, if you like, and then we break it out. And, something like, drums, bass, guitars, keyboards, strings, piano. But in some cases, as was the case with this, there were certain cases where it was advantageous to actually treat the strings as a thing, because there was sometimes more than one element making that up. But it was a conscious decision to say the strings are the strings.
They're an entity.
They're an entity.
Yeah.
They don't need to be. There was no point in subdividing. But there were situations where there was two piano parts, because there was kind of a rhythm part. And there was a kind of like an arpeggio part over the top, which was quite high. And so that's the sort of thing where it's possible at the dubbing stage, they may want to actually break that apart or tweak it or change it. And it may be as simple as they want to start it later or end it earlier. Or it may be just a case they want to tweak the balance.
Sure.
But that's effectively what we would give over. And usually we would give it over on how we've mixed it, like a cue by cue basis. So each cue would have its own session, and then all the files are time stamped, so they will go to the current place as per that picture, and then they go off to either the production supervisor or the music editor, and then they will usually build them into a big session to suit the needs of the dubbing process.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time here today. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. It's Mike Thornton, and we're from Presley's Expert at Jigsaw's base in London. See you again soon.